Hello again, Charlotte here. Right, we're going to start a pencil tutorial of the pear that's in the photograph we've been looking at for all of our samples. Now you might have seen the charcoal and the white pastel examples I did of this object, so for consistency I'm going to focus on the same one. Now the reason that I'm doing the pencil one last, although, of course, you might not watch them in order, so this could be your first one. But sometimes people get a little bit hung up on the pencil shading because it's what most people use. And it can feel quite complicated when you're looking at all the detail here. There's a tendency or a danger to get a little bit too carried away with some of the markings on the skin of the pear, the really fine detail through here. And I want to show you that you can actually do a really nice drawing of this in a very loose way, so you don't have to get too particular about all of this detail, and certainly not when you're starting out. It's really easy to be put off if you feel that you can't replicate something photographically, and I don't want you to think that that's necessary at all. Having said that, if you've done a fair bit of drawing in the past and you're getting some new ideas from this video, then do feel free to really explore some of this additional texture through there. But I'm going to show how it can be done in a very, very simple way. Now, I want to just give you a little reminder about some of the key points from our 6 points, 3 tones. Remember, lightest, darkest, everything in between. Just like my high tech. See, I've always been really high tech, haven't I? And in those 3 tones, if we just look back at the image, of course, the areas which are the lightest, then you have the darkest shadows, and then everything in between, of course, all of these mid-tones, and you've got the really dark shadow underneath. Now, because we're working on white paper, the lightest tone is already done for us. You can't get whiter than the white paper. So it means we're just concentrating on shadows. Isn't that brilliant? And another key point, edges explain texture. So I'm going to be looking at that a little bit more carefully while I'm doing this study. So you'll see that I've just got my one pencil. I'm using the 2B pencil, which is my favourite. It's a really good mid-tone, not too soft and black, so you can rub it out quite easily, but you can get a lot of variation. But to be honest, if you've only got an HB, which is quite a traditional sort of school type pencil at home, you can use that as well. Because the most important part of this is being able to find a material that you like and then working out how to get light and dark with that one material. And if you're using a big set of pencils which someone's given you, or maybe you've had it in the cupboard for a while, that's brilliant, but you don't need to worry about materials and tools at this stage. It's learning how to vary the pressure of your own hand with just one material to create lots of different effects. So I'm starting with the simple pear shape. Now you might want to, when you're doing this study, you might want to actually use some of those measuring techniques and transfer techniques like the grid to actually get a really good looking pear onto your paper to do this pencil study. But you could equally just do what I've done, a really nice simple pear shape. Remember, the shadow underneath is just as important as the object itself because it explains the context, how the object is sitting on the table. So that's really, really important. And remember our lightest, darkest, and everything in between. So what I'm going to start with is grounding down the pear. Now that might actually seem like an odd place to start at the bottom, but this will help to establish one of the darkest areas in the drawing. And you know, I said before, if you're using, say, an HB pencil or just one that you've got lying around in your just in the kitchen or something from your school supplies, the thing to do at this stage is to work out, well, how dark can you go with your material? So I can actually get quite black lines by using the 2B and pressing nice and hard, but then I can also really get lovely soft light lines. So as long as you establish what is the darkest you can get with your pencil, then everything from that point, because we've got the lightest area, of course, is being represented by the paper itself, and now creating the other extreme, the darkest areas, now I can work on all of the tones that are in between. And even just doing that, you see how it starts to look like a thing sat on a piece of paper. And you know, I'm just going to do a little bit of smudging here. Smudging is a great way to get a simple shadow. One thing you might find if you're smudging with pencil or with charcoal, sometimes just the oils at the end of your fingers, in your natural oils in your skin, they might create little blobs and catch on the pencil or the charcoal and be a little bit hard to rub out. But that's all it is. It's just the oils mixing in with the material. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reinforce that line. And if you haven't printed out the picture, just have a look at Mr. Pear again, or maybe it's Mrs. Pear. This image here, you see how dark all the way around the outside, and it's light on this side. But when we get to the edge here, I'm going to show you again about the context of having an object not just floating in the middle of nowhere, and we'll be reminded again about the importance of remembering there are no lines anywhere, it's just shadow. Now remember one of the high-tech cards I showed you just before, which said edges explain texture. Now this is a really good place where I can demonstrate that. So your eye can tell that the side of the pear here is nice and smooth because the edge of the shape where the light meets the dark there is very, very smooth. Now, if I did this, you see how straight away the top part of the pear looks like it's got, well, roof tiles or bits hanging off it. Because if we understand that 3D is explained through light and shade, then our brain says, well, if there's dark spaces here and light spaces there, well, obviously there's something hanging off the side of the object to create that pattern, whereas here it's silhouetted in a very sharp, smooth line, so we instantly understand the nature of the object. So having nice crisp edges, and that doesn't mean an outline, it's having a crisp edge, is very important. Now what I've done here is I've just reinforced that line to make it stand out, and then this is also a really important aspect of drawing, and a lot of students ask me this. They say, do we need to follow the shape of the object with our pencil lines? So pear has a big bulge around here. You kind of know that, don't you? And the lines could go this way. They could also go that way to describe the bulge. Now, of course you can do this, but that can also be a relatively challenging thing to work out when you're just starting, being able to see the curves that are involved, say, in a cross-section of an object to make it look three-dimensional. What I'm doing here is it's actually called cross-hatching, but in a very simplistic way, where I'm going in two different directions to describe the shape of an object. Now that straight away you can start seeing the bulge here and the curve involved in the top neck of the pear, but you don't have to be able to do that. If we look at the photograph of the pear again, remember I said in one of the introductory videos that within the really dark shadow you can hardly see any detail, and there isn't very much other than pattern, there isn't very much detail in the light space, but where you understand the texture is through this middle section here. So actually, if you decide that you just want to do a pretty general kind of shading all through this really dark area, as long as none of your lines really leap out like a strong line like that, you see, remember, everything we look at is a jigsaw of light and shade. So for something like that, a really strong line, then the brain says, well, it must be, because remember, shadows and light explain 3 dimensions, that must be like a little shelf or a fold in the object, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. So you don't want to have any lines which stand out really strongly like that, because they confuse the eye and take away from being able to see the overall general shape. But there's absolutely no harm whatsoever in just filling in an entire area of shadow just in one block. If you can see where the edge of the shadow is, so I've got one edge here, and then I've got another edge through here, and I'm just going to create a little bit of an edge for when it's going to start blending into the light. Now, this might take just a tiny bit of practice. It's one of those little exercises which can be a little bit deceptive. You see how the way I've used the pencil has created quite smooth overall marks. And look at where I'm holding the pencil as well. I'm holding it quite far back. If you're holding it here like you do with when you're writing with a pen, you'll have quite a hard line, and it might be difficult to get soft pressure. So if you have your fingers a little bit further back, it allows for a little bit more pivoting, and you can get longer marks. So you might need to just practice being able to get very consistent, soft lines without suddenly, a strong one coming out like that when your hand digs in. And you see how much that stands out. Remember, every line you draw is a shadow. That's what we understand by shape, by lines in pencil. They are actually shadows. Okay, so you see how just very, very quickly, nice sideways shading, I've filled in a good half of the pear, and it's starting to make sense with this shadow here. I haven't done any smudging on this, but I could, just to blend that in a little bit. Rub that if you want to. If your marks are a little bit inconsistent, then smudging the pencil is a great way just to soften it and blend it in. Now up here, the stalk has a very dark end, like a little periscope, isn't it? Sometimes I feel like drawing little faces on these, but no, must take it seriously. You might find yourself getting a little bit distracted and wanting to make little friendly cartoons on what you're doing, and that's just fine. Do them in the corner of the page, or perhaps have a little person hanging off the stalk. Doesn't matter. It's all just fun practice, how to see things as they really are. And if you want to add in some fantastical elements too, be my guest. So I'm getting at just a little bit of variation in the shading of the stalk just by pressing less hard. That is all it is. There's no particular trick to that. I'm still keeping very consistent soft marks. Now, through here, it's still quite light through this central section. So I want to get a little bit of light pencil. And here, you see I'm doing diagonal marks, which goes against the whole curve of the pear. And I just want to show you that if it takes you a little while to work out which way the shape is going, which way the lines need to go, it actually doesn't really matter. You'll start to understand that the more drawing you do. But you see, when I smudge it, you can't see the diagonal quality of the line because I've done such light pressure. Now this is where I'm going to use a putty rubber here, but if you haven't got one of these, a bit of household blue tack is actually just as good. But blue tack is a tiny bit more sticky. I'm just going to make that into a little pad. The really good advantage of these rubbers, these erasers, or a little bit of blue tack, is that they don't leave any marks. The bits of eraser don't come off onto the paper. So when you're brushing off those little bits, when you rub things out, you don't smudge your drawing. So when you've done a really soft blend, so you see how the the blue tack is just picking up the surface graphite, and it allows for some very subtle changes of, I'm just doing a little twist like that, pressing and twisting, and it's creating those little circular motions which are very reminiscent of pear texture. Now I'm just going to bring, and that was just done with a bit of blue tack, so you don't have to have any really fancy equipment. It's just knowing what to use and actually giving yourself permission to use things which don't feel official. You know, it doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. Certainly not when you're starting out. This is about giving yourself permission to have some fun and learn a new skill. You can get all the equipment later on. Okay, so I'm just going to reinforce the dark shape around here, and I don't want to have any edges really standing out. There was a little bit of an edge standing up there which was starting to look too much like an outline. And yes, we are going to get to this side very shortly, because you might be saying, well, hang on, what about the right-hand side? That looks very outlined to me, Charlotte. And you're right. Okay, so you can work over and over and over areas like this if you want to. And if you want to use the pencil to create some of those little circular dimples as well as using the rubber, what I'm doing here is just creating some little circles and then crosses and squiggles, and that can also, you see how that starts to replicate the look of lumps and bumps. If every time you think your pencil is making a shadow, it can help you just to build up an impression. That's what you want to make, an impression of shape. What you have to be really careful of is pattern, because the eye loves a pattern. So if I did those there, don't they just leap out? Because we're understanding organic object, the brain instantly sees a pear, and to have those perfect circles there doesn't make any sense. So they really stand out, and it's the only thing that the eye then focuses on. So you want to make sure that if you're doing some little crosses and squiggles to give the impression of those lumps in the pear texture, and I'm just going to smudge it a little bit and use my rubber again, because I quite like the simplicity of the marks that I can get by just removing the graphites with some twists. I'm just going to use my official kneadable eraser now, just little twists, and you see how that just gives, see along this line, you see those little circles and dimples appearing. It gives the impression of texture, because at this point where the light is changing over the object, remember in the first video I did when we looked at the ceiling, and you could tell that the ceiling was textured by all the undulations and the changes in light and shade? This is exactly the same. And if you've only got a school eraser like this, or a plastic eraser, you can still, I'm just using the corner, you see there, and just drawing in little curves, and that gives also the same impression of texture and lump and bump as we go down that center. Now, the one thing which is really stopping this from looking three-dimensional and leaping out from the page is this line here. Remember, there are no lines anywhere, it's just shadow. So I want to give some environmental context to this object, even though it's just a little sketch. And just a little reminder, so in the photograph here, the pear behind, you see how dark that is? So the pear in front is silhouetted against the shadow behind there, and that is why we can see this, because there's a dark shape behind it. So I'm just going to use that as a little template and create, I'm just going to take this line, so remembering, you can say to yourself, it's like a little mantra, no lines anywhere, just shadows. So even if I start by just expanding that line, putting a little border or halo around it. Okay, so we get rid of the line altogether. And then I can do sideways smudging or lines. So I'm basically blending the line I had drawn around the outside of the pear, I'm blending that into the background. I'm blending it into the darker space. Now you can just do a light bit of squiggle just to give it a bit of context, and it's the same for the edge of the stalk, because of course the outside edge here, which is very, very bright, it doesn't actually have a dark line around the top and the right hand side. So I'm just going to put in some environmental context, but you see how that line still stands out a great deal because the pencil is going in a different direction. So if I just smudge that slightly, okay, and now we're starting to see this bright side of the pear just pop out. And what you can do just to balance it, I mean, you could leave it like that if you wanted to, but just to balance it, put a little bit of, and I don't have to worry about the edge of this side. I don't have to be careful because of course it's much darker on that side. So I can just get a nice free mark happening. Bit of smudging, but you don't have to smudge. See again here, even with the shadow, there's a line very visible. I don't want any lines visible. It's just shadows. And here. Okay. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of cleaning up. So you can either use just your normal school rubber, or if you've got one of these kneadable erasers. And as always, that conversation between light and dark. Sometimes you rub off just a little bit too much. I need to go back in with the pencil. And up here is going to be a really good example of that. So remember, I'm making my spatula shape with the putty rubber. Again, you can just use a normal eraser just to draw a line there. See, suddenly that makes it nice and bright. But if you take off a little bit of pencil that you didn't want to remove, you just go back in. Nice and easy conversation between light and dark. Now, one thing I want to do here is just to show you, if you find that you've got one area which is significantly darker than another area, like the background, and you don't want that, you can do a very simple motion with your blue tack or your putty rubber, which I just call press and lift. So if you press and lift, it will, I'm doing a little bit of a rolling motion. It just takes off that top layer of graphite without removing any of the lines or details. I can still see those. It's just lightening everything. So that makes it just balance a little bit better on both sides. And there we have, now we can see, oh, a little bit of rubber there. Perhaps I'll just make that side just a tiny little bit darker, just with the, look how shiny that is now, like Iron Man finger. Okay, there we go. I'm really, really quick and simple, nice and easy, and anybody looking at that would be able to say, well, I hope so. Oh, look, it's a pear. All right, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It doesn't have to be stressful. It's just always thinking about the jigsaw of light and shade, that conversation between light and dark, going back and forward, just taking your time and really being able to see those three tones, lightest, darkest, and then everything in between. And we've got ourselves a nice little pencil sketch pear. Now, if you see like some of those dots and circles, if they start to look a little bit too patterned, you see how I've got them in a really clear line down the middle, which is almost looking like sort of crocodile skin, isn't it? Now we want to just break that up a little bit. And because your eye is always drawn to a pattern, and I'm just using the normal eraser here. You can use the putty rubber if you want to, and just smudging, softening that edge. We're still going to see some of those shapes, but you see how that just softens out the pattern. Oh, I've got a big bit of smudge there from something. You'll find that sometimes you get your hand in the wrong place, or maybe when I've been brushing it off, I've created a little bit of additional smudge. But there you go, nice and simple, Pear 101. Now it's your turn. Go and have some fun. Bye.